This is LCC Radio WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. You're listening to the Lansing Online News Radio show with Bonnie Bucqueroux and Bill Castanier. This is coming up on our holiday weekend. This is the weekend everybody comes back to school at Michigan State. The classes are starting. Everybody is getting excited. And this morning, Bill Castanier, who has attended every one of the One Book, One Community sessions that kick off the school year at MSU. You were there this morning when John Lewis spoke, and you know John Lewis, so how did you think that went this morning?
I think it went better than any that I've seen previously.
Is that right?
I think there were more students at this one. They seemed awake. And John Lewis is an incredibly inspirational speaker. I think if one person in that 7,000 gets the message, he's a success.
Now his book is March.
March, book 1, and he will have 2 others. And this is about his early life, leading up to Nashville, where they led the sit-down strike. The next one is, I think, about Selma to Montgomery, and then the following one, and I may be reversing them, is about Freedom Summer. I think the next one is Freedom Summer, which would be logical. And so he's taking his major activism and putting them in 3 graphic novels, which is a first. So the kids didn't have to wade through some terribly long thing.
That was probably an advantage, wasn't it?
And it is just as emotional as any book I've read. The graphics are powerful. They don't, they show what happened in powerful comic style graphics. And the students gave him a standing ovation. I've never seen him stand for anyone else.
Is that right?
And hopefully they now know who he is and what he represents, and that he's the last remaining member of the, I think there may have been 10 that spoke at the March of Washington.
See, that's what's stunning to me, is that generation is disappearing.
Absolute icon. And he put his life on the line many, many times, and
certainly did almost died at the foot of the Edmund Pettus Bridge.
Pettus Bridge, he had a terrible concussion. Even so, he went back and spoke through it. I mean, he went back and addressed a group of 2,000 back at a church, but then he was put in the hospital immediately.
And it disturbs me that he was spat upon as he was going into Congress a few years ago, and somehow that became controversial. It's that, well, did it really happen? I find that appalling, as if he would lie about something.
Yeah,
like that.
This man has
stunning.
I don't know if it's exactly accurate, but he has no guile. I mean,
right.
He is who he is, and he doesn't have to pretend to be anyone else.
Yeah.
And he's very non-assuming. He could walk into a room, and if you didn't know who he was, he wouldn't bother to tell you.
Well, you said too, he really seemed to be engaged with the students. Sometimes people come in and they're talking to an audience, but he really seemed to connect.
I think his first half of his speech, of course, was probably about his book, which it was. I mean, it was, because it's a fun book too. The early part of his life, how he preached to chickens for practice. And he doesn't think he ever got him to say amen, though. He's funny. He's got funny lines to him. But the second half spoke to the students and the activism that they should have in their life, that everybody should be part of a bigger world, and they have a responsibility to do that. And like I said, if one person in that entire group, it makes a difference in their life. I mean, Dave Hollister, we saw him speak last night at an event with Bob Greene and John Dooley, who were activists in the civil rights movement. And David Hollister, I can't remember if he said this last night, but yeah, he did. He talked about, he saw Martin Luther King speak at MSU, and that changed his whole life, who he is and who he was. And it can make a difference.
He walked out, he was so inspired, and he said he changed what he did.
And he certainly has committed his life to activism.
He joined the STEP program here in East Lansing.
Which is going to celebrate its 50th anniversary next year, where more than 100 students went down to Russ College for 3 years in a row. Pretty remarkable. And Russ College is going to recognize it this November with a plaque.
Oh,
and I said, okay, why don't we have one here on campus? I mean, 100 kids went down there, and those 100 kids, I talked to a lot of them for a story I did a couple years ago, and they were in fear of their life every day. Nothing had changed in 1 year. Mississippi was still a nasty place to be if you were black and white together. Black alone was enough, but black and white together was terrifying for those kids.
Yeah.
Because they were only 22, 23.
Yeah.
Many of them went on to monstrous jobs and careers.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, they clearly were leaders.
Oh, absolutely.
And that's...
And they were brave.
I guess what, and I mean, this is an illusion I'm sure everybody drew, but it seems particularly profound to have these experiences happening now in the light of what happened in Ferguson. And I'm not sure that we have the same forceful leadership that we need to be able to articulate what the goals are, what the principles are, what the fundamentals are. I'm worried that the dialogue may not be as pointed as it needs to be nowadays.
Well, and I think you're right. And the co-author, Andrew Aden, who I could see tonight, earlier this morning, the two are very close. Mm-hmm. John Lewis and his aide. I mean, he's one of the aides, junior aides, frankly, in his office. But you can tell when somebody's close. And it was quite obvious. And I asked Andrew about it, and he said he's like the father I never had.
Yeah.
But he said the congressman's goal right now is to get out and talk to people, because nothing is happening in Congress.
Yeah.
So his last kind of his goals right now toward the end of his career is to talk to people in the field to see if he can get them to believe again that you can make changes. And we'll see if it happens. He stirred up people today.
I was reading Cornel West's piece over the weekend where he said that we thought we had Coltrane, but we ended up with Kenny G, which I thought was about as unkind and... Yeah, that one would hurt. And but I thought it is sort of true that we went from, George Bush, the sort of frat boy, calling people pooty poot, when you're dealing with international relations, and then we have what appears to be what I thought was going to be more of a rabble-rouser who was held in check. And instead we have more of a technocratic administration that's tinkering at the margins. After the response to Ferguson is to do a review of the sending of military gear to local police agencies. I would like to see a halt on sending any more gear to local police agencies until we have some sort of thorough review. I mean, I think we need a more bite in some of the decisions that we're making.
I know you saw these stories, Bonnie, because you read them carefully, but there were some veterans of Afghan and Iraq who said they weren't as well armed. And they were much more careful with their weapons when they rolled in Iraq and Afghan.
Yes.
So,
And that's what everybody's saying about the...
Yes, Lisa Cook, Dr. Cook is joining us from the Department of Economics at Michigan State University.
And that's what veterans are saying, that they would never use their weapons in this way. They would never present themselves in this way, not even in the field. So I think they're much more cautious. But we also saw that during the Bush administration. Those who were the most hawkish, who wanted us to go to war, had never been in one. And Colin Powell, if you remember, was saying, I mean, the Pottery Barn maxim is the one that seems to be pervasive, simple but pervasive. If you break it, you own it. And if you use all of this power, you have to be able to own it, own all of it, own what we're seeing now. But I just want to go back to a point you were making earlier. The leadership may not, you're saying the leadership may not be there. I'm not sure if it's the leadership. I think it might be that, for example, the Black church offered many opportunities for leadership, for training, for education in a previous generation. Folks aren't going to church so much anymore. There are many more outlets for their activities.
So it's the institutions
so partly the institutions, partly participation, a sense of civic participation. That generation is dying off. My cousin, Floyd McKissick, one of the co-founders of CORE, Jim Farmer, is dead now. I mean, John Lewis was the youngest of that group at the March on Washington, speaking on the platform there. So we can see that I think he's doing the right thing, getting out and talking to people. Because, I said to my students, and I've said this a couple of times this summer, it astonishes my students to hear that in my hometown, the town that my parents moved to in the 1960s from Washington, D.C., they moved to Millersville, Georgia, that we couldn't be served. There was no place we could be served except at the place that had federal funding, which was the large state hospital. So they cannot believe it, and it's jarring for them. And we have to sort of move on from the subject because it makes them extremely uncomfortable that was not so long ago. It was 1980 when my skating rink was desegregated. So I don't think that they understand, and what I see in Ferguson is sort of what I saw in my hometown growing up in the 1980s. And this is just delayed desegregation, delayed empowerment, just a lot of delayed things that probably needed to happen earlier. But I don't think it's just leadership.
Probably not, but I don't see and it's too bad, I think, in an era where we do have more opportunities for people to be blogging, to have their own networks, to do these kinds of things, that we haven't seen new media become an outlet for a new kind of galvanizing action here. We've seen the use of social media in Egypt. We've seen it in all these other places, and if for some reason there's a passivity I see among so many young people nowadays that it's hard to get them energized.
Well, possibly, but I would say that Twitter was on fire.
Yes, it was.
And I'm only on Twitter, so I don't know about the other media.
Yes.
But Twitter was burning hot, just like it was in Tunisia, in Syria, in Egypt. So I don't think, in that sense, it's different. And
it was with the pictures of the memes and the hashtag for the thing, like which picture would they use, right? If I'm shot dead today, which picture are they going to run? Are they going to run the one of me in my graduating for college, or are they going to run the one of me with a bottle of booze and maybe looking a little bit casual? But I didn't see. Yes, we ended up with a lot.
Very volatile environment. Things could change very quickly, happen very quickly. So I wouldn't necessarily show up.
I feel guilty for not showing up. I thought if I were a real journalist, right, with my backpack camera, I should have been down there doing live webcasting from the site. I mean, that it seemed to me that if I were a young person nowadays, I would say that's where I'd have to be. That it is, you do have. I mean, Viola Liuzzo went from Detroit down to the South, and she's very famous in Michigan because she was killed. I mean, you're right. It's within our generation. It's within our lifetimes, and kids may not realize that. They think that's ancient history.
Right.
But what we're seeing now is the statistic that white officers kill 2 African Americans every week in the United States. That is the same rate as lynching in the 50s. Now, when you look at that, it's not that much different. It's a different kind, and then I'm going to get a lot of hot water for this, but it's a different kind of lynching. It's an institutional kind of lynching on the part of the armed forces that we have on our own domestic streets. I mean, we had posse comitatus that said that you could not turn your domestic police agency into a militarized police. And that's gone by the wayside, and I'm stunned that it happened. Apparently, too, I do know the man who was put in charge of that Office of Technology Transfer. And a lot of it was done surely on the basis of economics, that we have all this leftover gear. It's sitting there rusting. We don't know what to do with it. It's going to cost us to dispose of it. We might as well dispatch it to these police agencies and let them have it for anti-terrorism work. But it is absolutely true that if you give those people give people those kinds of toys to play with, particularly in our macho male environment.
Sure.
I was there when community policing lost the battle to militarized SWAT-type tactics. And it was Daryl Gates who invented the SWAT team, and there's no mystery about that. My boss was once at a meeting with Daryl Gates where he said we won't have peace in the society until we push all of those people into the ocean. And it wasn't too hard to figure out who he meant by those people. And that kind of policing won out, and it should never have been allowed to happen. But I don't know how we roll it back.
Well, and that's a good question. We saw the same thing, though, and research has shown this. After the assault weapons ban was lifted or not renewed, we saw all of these weapons showing up, these semi-automatic weapons showing up in Mexico. So it's not a mystery. There's a direct link between the two, and there's a lot of money to be made in the weapons trade. And a lot of lives have been lost as a result.
And that's been the case with weapons since the beginning of time when weapons were used.
One of the things
they ended up in hands of people that shouldn't have them, and should the military have ever had them?
There was a very poignant segment on Melissa Harris Perry's shows yesterday where they were talking about the use of tear gas, and it reminded me that gentleman who'd been on the street in Ferguson talked about the fact that when you've got kids in neighborhoods, this is a weapon that's banned in war. They don't use tear gas in war because it's considered inhumane. Now that's sort of a stretch, that somehow it becomes okay to use then on city streets. The idea was that for this case of officer safety, there was a water bottle thrown against one of their tanks. You know, a water bottle isn't going to do a heck of a lot to a tank, but to use that as a justification for lobbing tear gas into neighborhoods where traumatized kids are now afraid. There was just that case where there was a traffic stop and a young 6-year-old boy ran out of the car with his hands up yelling, don't shoot, because of what he's been seeing on TV. We have a generation of kids who are growing up thinking, I mean, look at how we look around the world when you see the kinds of things that happened on the streets of Ferguson with tanks rolling in and tear gas being lobbed into residential neighborhoods. There's something really wrong.
Well,
with
Russia's using it in their new, rolling out of their new media. They've got a whole propaganda machine, and that was a big segment on their recent TV, was about Ferguson.
And you know, I'm more accustomed to seeing, it's interesting that you should bring up Russia, I'm more accustomed to seeing these heavy-handed tactics in other parts of the world, in Africa, in Russia, but not here.
Right.
Not here. I mean, and you think this is the hallmark of civilized economies, of civilized societies, that we don't tear gas our people, or we don't treat our people this way, such that 6-year-olds run out of a car saying, don't shoot me.
Yeah,
I mean, a 6-year-old. A 6-year-old is a first grader.
Yes.
A first grader.
Yes.
I can't imagine it. This should not be a first grader's experience. This is outrageous. Not in a developed, civilized country. No.
Well, the question is, how civilized are we? I guess.
We're maybe not be moving in the right direction.
This is LCC Radio WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Dr. Lisa Cook about some of the recent events down in Ferguson, Missouri. And I guess one of the things, the other comparison that disturbs me is when we look at the lack of action that was taken at the Clive and Bundy Ranch. It says that if you are a right-wing extremist and you point guns at the police, which I think is quite interesting, that you can lay there in an overpass with an assault weapon and point it at a federal officer, and there's what happens, the federal officers retreat, and there is no blowback for that. No one's been arrested. No one has still yet come in and done anything to Clive and Bundy. I mean, I was not happy. I was one of the few lefties that was really frightened by what I saw at Waco, because there again was the use of tear gas. It is an incendiary weapon in addition to being a chemical weapon, and it certainly burned down the place with all of those people inside of it, contributed to the fire. Whether it's the sole cause of the fire or a contributory factor will be debated till I'm long gone. But the reality is that we're using these kinds of weapons of war in urban areas and rural areas in the United States. I guess we've backed off doing it to white extremists, but now it's still acceptable to do in urban neighborhoods, and I don't understand what the rules are anymore.
Right, and I think as well, the report that would have put Bundy on many people's radar was suppressed. I mean, it was put up, by the federal government that listed hate groups. And now it's been swept under the rug. It's been taken offline. So we're going around acting as though everything is hunky-dory. We're not taking various precautions, and certainly the police aren't arresting people like Bundy, and it's terrifying. So that means that things are being swept under the rug, and people are not aware that this kind of activity is going on.
I'm concerned because I was looking at some of the, we had talked earlier that we want to make sure that we focus on a lot of the underlying economic issues. And one of the big things about Ferguson that was interesting to me was that not that long ago it was a predominantly white suburb. But what we've seen in so many of these cities that ring urban areas is that as the economics change, and in particular as with the loss of manufacturing jobs, the shift towards retail and low-end paying jobs, what we're seeing is a lot of the suburbs becoming less affluent. And as they become less affluent, they also tend to be, there's a lag time between now, we see 69% of the people in Ferguson are black, as opposed to it being a white suburb anymore. But there's a lag time between when that happens and the political leadership and the police leadership reflect the community. And those are the worrisome times to me. And what they're talking about, and it's part of what I learned when I was so deeply involved in policing, there's so many of these little agencies. They each have 20, 30, 40 officers. They don't have very many. It's extraordinarily expensive to keep funding all of these little tiny police agencies. The gentleman who is currently under threat of arrest for the shooting of Michael Brown, his agency was disbanded because it did such a bad job of policing the community. It was literally disbanded as an agency that should
It was
not be.
corrupt also.
Corrupt
It was
also.
stealing money.
And so those officers get absorbed by these other places. There's not enough money to have run all these little agencies and give sufficient training to be able to give the kind of backup and support that they need. So, I mean, we have a really badly broken system, it seems to me, and no political will to fix it. Where do the jobs come from for the people in Ferguson? Where are we going to see some hope for those kids who are growing up in that community? This was a young man, Michael Brown, who was headed to college this week.
Exactly. I mean, it is such an ironic metaphor.
Yeah.
Right? You know, the kid was headed to community college,
Yeah.
and you know, what you needed, or what you need now in an area like Ferguson, is more skill-based training so that you can get a higher paying job, because places like Emerson used to be a big employer there and has stayed there. A lot of other companies have left, like Anheuser-Busch and AT&T have left Missouri, but Emerson stays and has kept jobs there. But many of those jobs went to the South and to China. And the question is, and as you rightly said, Bonnie, many of them have been replaced by lower end service jobs. So if you can get just a little bit above that, to get to more skills, get an associate's degree, get a bachelor's degree possibly, you can make a big difference, because the wage differential is going to be large if you have some skills and you can acquire some of those higher skilled jobs. So I think it's a metaphor for what's going on in America and what's going on in the world. And that's why this is all the more tragic.
Yeah. He was the success story. He was headed there in heating and air. And it would, you know, he was exactly the kind of young person that you say was going to be doing a good job of taking advantage of the opportunities that were there.
Right.
He had no record. Based on what I'm seeing in the political system and in the criminal justice system down there, it seems unlikely that the officer will ever really, if he ends up arrested, that he'll ever be convicted. There's been plenty of maneuvering done to make sure that the investigation is pretty shoddy. And it would be very hard to convict him anyhow. The bar is very high. They're going to do a lot of delaying tactics and use a grand jury instead of a preliminary hearing, so no one will know what the testimony is. It'll be kept secret, so there'll be no transparency. We see just a few days later the young man shot in St. Louis, roughly 4 miles away. I watched that videotape in horror. That by the time they keep saying there was 23 seconds, I actually only found 14 seconds between when the police officers got out of their car and when that young man was dead. And it just seemed to me it was less about officer safety and more about we don't have to care, we can just execute.
Right.
It's part of the protocol nowadays. Huffington Post ran a series of 6 animated GIFs showing some of the recent incidents. There's something profoundly wrong with what's happening with policing in urban areas nowadays, and I don't know how we fix it.
And I think young African males know it.
Yes.
I mean, they understand this intimately.
Oh yeah, and their parents understand it too. I mean, Eric Holder's story for a movie, and he's already a federal prosecutor. I mean, he and the president have these stories. This is not how developed, civilized economies or countries or societies run themselves. This is what they do for their people. If standards of living are supposed to be increasing, this is a step backwards.
Right.
This is retrogression. But you're saying that it is probably unlikely that the officer will be convicted, and I'm really disturbed
I'm not even sure
by
he'll
that.
be arrested.
Right. Well, that's right. Well, let's even start there. Did you see the video? So somebody was live tweeting the murder of Michael Brown. Did you see that?
No.
So a couple of hours ago, I just happened to be online and surfing, and on Twitter I saw that this there was a person who was live tweeting the murder.
Really?
Yes. So I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure that these kinds of tactics that you and I both know well, and that have been used to good effect in the past, can be used in an era of much more transparency than we've ever had.
We certainly do long for the video on this one, don't we?
Yeah, so there was a still that I was looking at on Twitter, but I didn't click on it, so I don't know if it were video or not.
Wow.
But unlike you, I don't have the stomach to look at any of this, so I haven't seen any images except Michael Brown's face and sort of pictures from his family.
Unfortunately, too, they left his body lying in the street so long that, 4.5 hours.
4.5 hours.
That so
No
many
respect
people
whatsoever.
went by.
That was.
No,
Took
and
video, took pictures,
And
posted.
isn't this every parent's nightmare?
Oh.
Every parent's nightmare. Did my child suffer? How did my child die? Was it an opportunity to save my child?
Yes.
I mean, and I mean, this must be the absolute source of grief. And again, I'm accustomed to seeing this in other places, like, Nigeria,
Yeah.
bodies not picked up for days, or Russia. I'm accustomed to seeing that, but I don't think that's how developed, civilized economies and societies run themselves. I just don't see that. I'd never think that it would take 4.5 hours for somebody to come and pick up either a nearly lifeless or lifeless body. I mean, I think it's outrageous.
That's the difference between policing in different communities. In a gated community, it's all handled very discreetly. It's handled primarily by the security guards in concert with police. In the public policing arena, it's totally different. I spent an hour and a half on the telephone about a decade ago with a grandmother who had lost her grandson. She had grounded him because he had done some things that she didn't approve of, and he snuck out the bedroom window and went with friends to a party. And he took a ride home because he was afraid his grandmother would come down for a bed check and find out he wasn't back in bed in time. So he took a ride with strangers at 11 o'clock at night from a party so he could get home. They were stopped at a corner. There was an altercation. It was supposedly gang territory. Bullets rang out. The 15-year-old boy is dead on the street. Grandmother is told, she comes to the site, she runs to the area, and you see on the video when Bill Curtis, who is out of Chicago, who did things for A&E, he did a show on this killing. And you see the young boy bleeding to death. He's dead there in the street and the blood coming out of him, literally running into the gutter. You see the grandmother running up hysterical because her grandson has been murdered. You see all of this. Unfortunately, what she also saw without any warning was she saw that on TV one night when she was rolling around the dial because she didn't realize she'd been videoed and she didn't know he had been videoed. But we turn that into a kind of violence porn that appears on a lot of these different cable shows. I'm happy that John Walsh, who I've met over the years in victim work, is, out there trying to catch, quote, the bad guys. But I don't like the way it's glorified, and I don't like the way it's presented, and I don't like the hyping of this as if somehow this is this sort of revenge culture that we're into, of violence on all sides, and good guys and bad guys, and where do you fall, and you do anything to catch the bad guys kind of mentality. I think it's really coarsening the culture, and I think we have to be careful about where that's taking us as well. This is LCC Radio WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Dr. Lisa Cook, and one of the things I wanted to mention is the changing value of the housing stock in a community like Ferguson. We're still seeing that housing stock in the United States is not really recovering. Some new data today didn't look very good for housing costs recovering. New home starts are down again. There's been this softening, apparently, of the economy again. I was very disappointed to realize, I looked up some of the stats when I was thinking about those people in Ferguson, and it says that the average white household now has 22 times as much wealth as the average black household. When you look at that disparity, I mean, it just seems to me to be so stark. And let's face it, most of our wealth comes from our homes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And furthermore, what we found out during the financial crisis was that African Americans and Hispanics were just wiped out. Hispanics more than any other because they were so invested in their housing and so invested in their mortgages and in their houses. And if you don't have that base, if you don't have assets to draw from in case something happens or just in general.
Right.
Some people take for granted the fact that they get to go to college, whether it be community college or four-year college. Michael Brown had found the resources to show up at a community college, had the wherewithal to do so. That's why this is such a tragedy, again, because African Americans rely on income. They rely on income, just like Hispanics do.
Yes.
The multiple isn't as high for the wealth gap for Hispanics and whites, but relying on income. And this is what is going to change their path from now on. And if they don't have access to that, they're not going to have access to the benefits of higher standards of living.
I am only where I am because my father was white and bright after World War II and was able to get a job in a factory and rise up the ranks. Mm-hmm. And when I was born, and by the time that I was an adult, I once needed a grub stake of $8,000 to be able to put as a down payment on a house. Mm-hmm. That house and my ability to parlay that over time into other houses, get it paid off, all of that kind of, that is really the grub stake that constitutes my wealth. If it had not been for that investment in my future, I don't see that I would be anywhere near as financially secure as I am now. There was a time where we were on the outs and I needed $10 and I didn't go to them for it because we were not speaking. And what that meant was I didn't buy an $8 bottle of pills, and my first husband had a blood clot go through his heart and almost ended, and it ended quite badly. And I should have gone for the $10. I should have not let my pride stand in the way. But it's surprising sometimes a small infusion of money can make a huge difference in a person's life.
Yeah.
And if the family doesn't have it,
where's the money come from then?
where will it come from?
Government needs to step in.
Yeah. I mean, Mitt Romney's solution was, ask your dad for it.
Yeah.
To start your business. But you're right.
Be a rich man's.
Exactly. But yes, I mean, that's right. There are programs that we've had in the past that are no longer funded, that were for job training, that were for college access. And we certainly
even
need
summer
this
jobs.
and some of those are the ones that I'm thinking about.
Comprehensive employment
Job
training.
Corps, I think.
Job Corps.
Yeah.
I worked in those programs, and I was in government, and did a lot of visiting those programs. They were amazing things to see.
And people, even in my small town where not many people would have benefited from it, when people benefited from it, they went on to careers. These were not just jobs. They went on to careers. So just from anecdotal evidence, it seems as though they were successful. But you're right. I think there is a role for government policy, government intervention here.
All those programs are over. And Michigan used to have a Michigan Youth Corps that employed over 10 summers, more than 100,000 kids.
Wow.
It was, and it ended under a Republican administration. One of the first things he did was end it. And I remember we did a lot of national research looking at what the impact was on these kids. And one of the things that came out of it is it was the first time they interacted with other races.
Yes.
Which was incredibly positive. We didn't think that would be an answer. We were going, what?
Right.
It's what the military with the draft used to do. It used to take people from different backgrounds and put them in together for a while. I took a bus one time up to the UP, and it was during the era when the Job Corps was going on, and I was on the bus with a bunch of kids who had been from one of the Job Corps programs and heard them trading stories. And it was clear that they had learned so much in that experience. They were still, there were some pretty spicy stories about fights and so forth that they'd gotten into, but it was one of those life-changing experiences that showed you there was a much broader world out there, and I don't know that we have those experiences now.
Right, and I think you bring up something that is critical, and that may be a leitmotif that's moving through these stories. The lack of empathy seems to be something that is leading to the coarsening of our society that you're talking about, because the draft would give people the opportunity to interact with one another, even if they had been seriously segregated before, or when the Negro Leagues had the chance to play baseball with white teams, it benefited both of them. Both. I mean, it was just amazing. Job Corps, same kind of thing. Peace Corps, same kind of thing. Right? Putting people in situations that may be outside their comfort zone, but at least they get to see that the blood that runs in the veins of that other person is also red. And I think that just feeling humanity, understanding that other person's humanity, seems to be partly what's missing in Ferguson.
And I think, too, you're right, that lack of empathy translates into a lack of investment in these kinds of programs.
Right, yeah.
If you don't feel that these
Yeah,
are, if
yeah,
they are the other,
yeah.
somebody that you don't care about.
That
then
should
you
be
know,
in prison.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right, right. In fact, those kinds of repressive techniques are exactly what we need. That's what I'm hearing too much of.
Oh, absolutely. I've heard it a lot.
It's very dangerous territory now to go to some websites online, by the way. The trolling is just so
Very
ferocious.
dangerous territory to hang around with people right now because they don't necessarily like your opinion. Wait a minute, we don't know that for a fact.
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about a few international headlines that have hit that I have to ask you about. What happened to our French government?
Je ne sais pas.
Did you see? Yes. And did you see the Business Insider's headline this morning? Blamed it all on Paul Krugman. The headline said,
Yeah.
"This one is Paul Krugman's fault."
I didn't see that. Why was Paul being
Because
being
they're fighting back against austerity. So after all, it's all his fault that government collapsed.
Oh my goodness!
Just
Well,
it was hysterical.
well, it's a real dilemma. I mean, Europe went down the path of greater austerity and prolonged their economic recovery, and this is the end result. And I mean, they've got to figure out which they want. So they're either going to get growth or they're going to get recession, if not depression. And it won't be just Greece. Clearly, it won't be just Greece.
No.
It won't be just Italy.
But
I
you know,
mean,
we thought that fragility was over. I mean, I read Zero Hedge, and they're always the ones that they're so far away. I mean, it's doom every morning. Doom on is their motto. And so, but you know, I thought that era was over, that we had gotten past that era of fragility.
Yeah.
So it's still lurking out there that we could still see Europe be the driver to take things down.
Yeah. I mean, there's so many places that could take down our fragile global economy. It could be Ukraine and Russia. It could be China, and it's interfering with
Israel and
our
Gaza.
airspace. It could be Gaza. It could be the Middle East. It could be our economy. I mean, there is fragility everywhere. There is weakness everywhere, and in all of these countries, people are hurting. People are hurting.
Yes.
So given that people are hurting, there could be all kinds of backlash.
And unrest.
Right? Yes, there could be all kinds of unrest. And in Europe, they're keenly aware of this. People will take to the streets as a common refrain in IMF negotiations. You can't tell X country to do this because people will hit the streets.
Yes.
But if you have this kind of discontent and it's just below the surface, anything could turn volatile.
Well, you know what surprised me? The Golden Dawn in Greece was really beginning to exercise its muscle. They were they were very smart in running all sorts of community-based programs and jobs programs for people. At the same time, they were clearly fascist right-wing fanatics in many cases. But the government cracked down on them. I mean, I think we would have had a harder time doing that. I think we're very gingerly, we treat the right with a certain amount of deference that we don't necessarily treat the left here. But in Greece, they seem to have no qualms about doing that. So they were willing to tackle, this sort of populist movement that's on the rise. But we're seeing it rising in France as well. I'm not sure the French are going to tackle it that way. So you're saying there's this sense that there's only so much maneuvering room without seeing this kind of thing unravel.
Yes, no, I think so. And I think that the laws are slightly different but quite similar across European countries with respect to Nazis. So they have a dividing line. So if you invoke Nazism, if any memory of the Holocaust is brought forward, that's one set of legal entanglements.
I see. So that's a third rail for them.
Yeah, exactly. That's a third rail. And that's when they really act. So I'm not surprised by the Greek government, and would not be surprised by the French government if things got out of hand with the front.
Now the problem is, if they it looks like they're headed into a potential deflationary cycle. That's very hard to get out of because consumers don't, if they think they can get it cheaper tomorrow, they're going to wait.
Yeah.
And the more you wait, then why not next week? Then why not the week
Japan's
after?
been a decade in a deflationary cycle. It's not a short-term event, and it's something to be avoided at all costs. So they're going to have to figure out with the ECB exactly what their strategy going forward is going to be. And, and I would say that the signs of a breakup are becoming all the more obvious for the Eurozone. This is not a natural currency union. You're supposed to bond with countries that have quite similar structures, economies. These can't be more different. They couldn't be more different.
So it was a forced.
Yes, and we all know why. I mean, the premise was that with greater trade relations, there'd be greater peace.
Right.
So they've gone, 60 years without a war. That is actually on their soil. That's actually a good thing. It's taken some time, but that's notwithstanding what was happening in the former Yugoslavia and so on. So another, let's say, world war. But it's still an experiment. It's still an experiment.
Yes.
I mean, because it's not clear that that Europe will always be in peace. And these entanglements, think about it, these entanglements with Russia, greater trade relations with Russia, have made some of these Western European countries paralyzed.
That's what
in
we're seeing
the face of
Ukraine.
doing something.
Yeah.
They are really dependent. So Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia are really dependent on agricultural imports to Russia, or their exports going to Russia. Poland is very dependent on Russia, I think, for apples. And the same is true for the Netherlands. I mean, they're dependent in both directions, for exports and for imports.
Meanwhile, the Europeans who would like a nice warm winter with some heat
Yes.
have to be nice to the Russians as well.
That's at least in the short run, because there are ways to diversify. I mean, they can get supplies from Norway, but that can't happen overnight. But they've been diversifying since their first big crisis with Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia. They have been diversifying, but it still takes years.
Well, we see the oil companies here lobbying for the idea that the United States could help just expand fracking and let's get more natural gas over there. And that would be about, what, a 10 or 20-year investment before the first drop would ever reach their border.
Right,
So.
right. I mean, it used to be that Gazprom was untouchable. It's now on the sanctions list. Rosneft was untouchable, and it's now on the sanctions list. I mean, there's just a little bit more I think they can do with respect to targeting companies and individuals.
But aren't we kind of hanging out there alone right now? Doesn't it seem as though we're not getting the support from our supposed European allies on this? So how far ahead of our skis do we get?
So I think that we'll see some fissures in the European community soon. I don't think people in the Netherlands are going to just sit by and say money is more important.
Okay.
And our energy dependence is more important. I think there will be, and I think that will get some other countries to think. And Angela Merkel seems to be a little bit more open than she used to be. So I think that they're going to be taking this a bit more seriously. But I don't know when Russia will sneeze. I don't know when the U.S. will sneeze. But it is odd to many Russians that their stores are now empty, and not because of U.S. sanctions, but because of Russian sanctions.
Right.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh.
They can't be
Yeah.
happy about this.
They can't be happy
No.
about this.
Yes.
It's
I
back
mean,
to the
it's-
Cold War to
Yeah,
them.
yeah,
And they're going,
right.
wait a minute.
And even worse than that, during the Cold War, they were getting all their produce and getting whatever they needed from the Eastern Bloc. And now they're saying even to the Eastern Bloc. So again, the Baltic countries to Poland, keep your apples. Keep your agricultural produce. We don't want it.
Yeah.
And they can't grow these things quickly. They can't grow them overnight.
No.
They can't get substitutes. So anyway, I mean, I think they're shooting themselves in the foot. So they have retaliated with the U.S. by saying that they're closing down the premier McDonald's.
Right.
Closing the premier
I thought it
McDonald's.
was the McDonald's doctrine, where if you got a McDonald's in there, somehow it was supposed to be that neutral trade was going to solve everything.
Well,
Just like with the
it
Eurozone.
did for a little while.
I
mean,
guess. People will do almost anything for a big one.
And next will be Starbucks.
Exactly. And then there'll be a riot.
If they take the coffee away, that's it.
Exactly. Well, I think if they get free Wi-Fi in Russia at their McDonald's, I think they're going to to be
Okay, now
many
we're
more,
talking.
right? Then
Now
we're talking. Then we're
But that was
talking.
like a non-starter.
Yeah.
Okay, we closed some McDonald's.
And then they back away for a little while. But they're only closing 4. I mean, and the Russian government says it's for sanitary reasons. Of course, they do this all the time. Anytime there's some sort of political point they need to score, they do this. They do the same thing with AIDS testing. So officially, you're supposed to have the results of an HIV/AIDS test when you enter Russia. You have no idea when it's going to be enforced. You know, most people don't carry that on them and with them, but when they want to be
Yes.
a bully, be mean, they enforce it. So the same sort of thing.
This is LCC Radio, WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. We're talking with Dr. Lisa Cook, and if we get back to the fast food wars, we now see that Burger King is about to consume Tim Hortons out of Canada, and it was kind of an interesting move because it's one of those where it allows them then to have their headquarters outside the United States, which saves them all sorts of corporate tax money because the corporate tax rate in Canada is less than it is here. And it means that one of the things I was checking on today, because I was trying to get a handle on, so how different is the tax rate in Canada here? It is significantly different. And indeed, I was looking also comparing individual income tax rates for Americans and for Canadians. They have lower tax rates higher up into the income scale, up to around 40,000, that we would cap off at about 25 at that rate. So, but they do have a lower high-end rate than we do. But you know what the big difference is? For that, people get basically free health care. And most of us average between $5,000 to $7,000 a year for health care costs for each family in the United States. Well, our military is obviously the big differential, I'm assuming, in the two economies. Where does that leave us? I mean, it does seem that is an economic threat to the United States.
It's not just the military. It's the largest economy in the world. It's the most integrated economy in the world. It's the largest market, the wealthiest market in the world, outside the EU. That's what these companies are getting. And the next time a company has one of their employees taken hostage in another country and needs for the American Navy to show up, the American Army to show up, or just a regular citizen. I think this is where our tax dollars are being used by the companies. Or there's a cyber attack on one of these companies. Who do they call? They call the American government. Right. So we don't hear about a lot of this, but these are our taxpayer dollars.
So
we're subsidizing them. So let them go. So when they report a cyber attack, don't call us. Don't call the U.S. federal government. When one of their employees is kidnapped in some country, don't call us. Don't call us. So that's what you're paying for. And I get the sense that they're trying to live on the cheap. I completely get that. But maybe the American government needs to do a better job of explaining what they get for their money, what kind of value this is. I, as an American citizen, when I'm abroad, register in an embassy. My friends who are, and I often go in multinational teams, my friends who are from other countries, including Canada, including Great Britain, including Australia, or Burundi for that matter, who are they registering with? Nobody's going to come get them.
Yeah.
I mean, so I really fundamentally am just incensed at these companies saying, I'll take this, I'll take that, but I don't want all of that, so I want to reduce my tax bill. And they're not saying what they're getting for it.
Yeah. Although it doesn't look like it did a very good job of bringing back Jim Foley.
No,
that was.
But I think you're making a really good point too. Is they also have a relatively stable economy, a stable government.
Yeah.
Somebody's not going to nationalize McDonald's here.
Right.
Well, that's
We hope.
right. No, the Jim Foley case is just it's just heart-wrenching. That it absolutely is. It's certainly not always going to work. Are we always going to try? Are we always going to try? We are always going to try. And
my concern is this great military might that we've had. If you read Chalmers Johnson's trilogy of books, that one of which was Blowback, unfortunately what we did was we basically started with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, and we have radicalized by our intervention each time we've gone in to try to change the scales. Anytime we think we're going to get rid of a radical group, we've simply left a more radical group in its wake, it appears.
And that's why Colin Powell said,
Yes.
if you break it, you own it.
But you know what? We got to stop breaking them.
We certainly have to stop owning them as a result. Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. But
And
I
that's
also,
so expensive.
right. And I would just add that it's not just our military power. So I'm
True.
thinking diplomatic power, diplomatic infrastructure.
Okay.
So these, when I go register at the American Embassy, I'm getting a network of people who might help in case I'm in need. People who will tell me what the radioactivity is in the air. Because when I was living in Moscow on a parade day, there was a tremendous, tremendous cloud in the air, and we didn't know what it was. And the American Embassy was telling us that there was tremendous radioactivity there.
Really?
So I'm just saying, it's not just our military might and our going and forcing ourselves on people. It's also, we're doing the same thing in China, telling many people, not just Americans, what the pollution readings are.
Yeah.
And you need a mask today. So it's a public service that we're giving to many different people. We're not just in these countries to attempt to colonize them in the 21st century way. I don't think so. My interactions have been
there is that whole other
abroad.
infrastructure that we often don't think about.
Yeah. And we support these companies abroad. The commercial offices are huge in these
They
places.
are.
So that's what I'm saying. It's not just rescuing one of their
Look at what's
kidnapped
happening now.
individuals.
When we take a look at what's happening with the Ebola crisis, clearly it's American medicine that is undergirding a lot of the efforts that are taking place. It's our
Right.
world, our funding of the CDC that's, this is where all the testing is done, this is where
Yeah.
all the protocols come from.
No, our funding of the FDA, our funding of
Yeah.
NIH
Yeah.
for basic research.
Yeah.
Yeah, so again, I think that these companies are looking for the lowest common denominator. We don't need that, we don't need that. Yes, you do, and you use it.
Yes.
They use our streets.
Yeah.
Right. I know.
Yeah. We use our streets, our street lights, our public transportation.
Yeah, I'm very offended.
Our educated
am I.
students that work in their stores.
Exactly.
I'm really
yeah.
offended
And
that
who
they're
had their companies.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, it's
Yeah.
it's an interesting era, and there are times where when you were talking about the fact that it's been so many years since World War II, and that we've been very fortunate that we have succeeded in staving off. I think we also have to be careful that we think that that is a permanent condition.
No, that's right. Yeah. We should always be reminded of how terrible it was,
Right.
so that we continue to be vigilant on a number of different fronts, and not just the economic front.
We look and we were calculating the loss of American soldiers in the Middle East in thousands, and that's a lot of young people, and
Yes,
it's certainly a
right.
worry. But when you start looking at the numbers from World War II, and you're
Oh, yeah.
talking 62
Oh, yeah.
million,
Oh yeah.
Oh, World War
scale-
One.
World War One. Yeah.
Yeah.
37
Yeah,
million
yeah,
Brits
yeah,
died
yeah.
on the first day of the war.
right?
I mean, we don't.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I'm not one to lionize warfare, but there is a reason to look back at it and see
Yeah.
what it did to an
Yeah.
entire continent almost.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
I mean,
because
absolutely.
the severity of the threats that we're dealing with nowadays are not easily solvable.
No, they're not.
And the
They're not.
kind of, to be honest about it, though they're maybe the most chilling, a group like ISIS really is still a relatively small group of people in a specific area. They're straddling Syria and Iraq right now and changing the landscape of the map. But I don't know that they pose the same kind of threat, although I guess they just did get an airport today where they're going to be
Right.
able to have the ability to shoot down planes that they didn't have before. So it's a very difficult and tense era.
Right, and they have access to drones.
Yes.
And Syria, that is certainly a concern. Another concern is that they could send people back. So the person who teaching the political economy of new capitalism.
Oh.
And we start with the question, and hopefully they're listening. Are you better off than your parents were at this age? And that starts the discussion.
I wonder who is.
Well,
You know what? We have a number of Chinese students, and many of them may well be.
Yes.
For them, it might
I
be
can't.
more.
I can't wait to hear. I don't know the
Yeah.
composition of my students yet, but they certainly could say that. Now, most are. I would hazard to guess that most are U.S. born students, and their parents didn't have as much college debt. And
Exactly.
I ask this question every year, and it's flipped. Most of them used to say that they were better off than their parents were at that age.
Yes.
And the last time I posed the question, which was in 2011, right after the financial crisis, they said the opposite. So,
Most of them have more stuff that they bring with them, though. I saw them moving in this week.
Oh, I'll bet. Yeah.
Dang!
they absolutely do.
I was interesting to listen to
They
John.
do.
I think it was John Lewis said he put everything he owned in a trunk. That's what I brought. I'm thinking,
Right.
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
trunk. We're in. We're moved in. Bye.
Bye.
Bill and I went to Morrill Hall before they took it down, and there were some places there that still were the bedrooms where from long ago, where they had just one little closet where the women brought in their trunk, and that was the
Oh,
sole
right,
possessions that they had.
Right,
You didn't have
right.
to bring your desktop and your laptop and your mobile
Right,
phones and all the rest of
right,
it.
right.
And I'm not saying it was better, but that was just
No,
the
yeah,
reality.
no,
When
that's
he
it,
said
that's
that,
it,
I thought
that-
that's
yep,
exactly
yep,
what
yep.
I moved in
I
with
saw
my
the same
dad's
thing.
trunk from World War II.
Well, see, the reason that I brought up the Chinese students was that last spring, out of 260 students, 160 of mine were Chinese, Asian students. So I have been practicing some phrases this summer so that when I greet my
Oh,
students
right.
this fall, at least I'm going to try to welcome them.
All right, good.
As a point of personal privilege, I would like to say that and extend my sympathies to the family of the 19-year-old student who was from China who did die this weekend here in town. And there is questions about whether it was from alcohol poisoning. And that has been a significant concern on campus for many years. And one of the issues, this is the 19th anniversary of my late daughter Kim's death from a combination of alcoholism and bulimia, which turns out to be far more toxic in females than it does in males. And I try to do something on many occasions to sort of honor that problem and talk about that. And I do think that there is an important message that needs to be conveyed to young people nowadays, which is that it is certainly, college is a time to have fun, and it is a time to cut loose and have a good time and kick up your heels and take advantage of being a young person, able to set your own rules and your own boundaries. But you don't want to make the kinds of decisions from which you cannot come back. And I guess what bothered me so much as I was thinking about Kim's death over the weekend and the intervening 19 years is that you are a long time dead and you miss a lot. And I look at the last 19 years of this country and some of the good things and the bad things that have happened and the rich experiences that I've been so privileged to enjoy. And I think about how much she has missed. And I would just like to urge everybody who out there and all you young people, take care of yourself. We will see you next Monday night. This is LCC Radio WLNZ 89.7 here in Lansing, Michigan. And thank you to Dr. Lisa Cook for joining us this evening. Come back and join us again next Monday at 7. Thank you.
My pleasure.